Thanks so much, Avery, and thanks to Reverends Goddett and Miss Glass Hill. Your stories are powerful, and we appreciate your willingness to share them with us and to call us to task to respond. I hope that all of us can be part of communities and support who are likely to support those who will most likely be affected. And on to our next session. The day keeps rolling, and I'm just so privileged to be joined today by three fantastic people with very different backgrounds and perspectives. Deke Arndt is a climate scientist with NOAA. He studies our changing climate every single day and then informs us on what's happening, why, and what will likely happen next. This knowledge, along with his faith, has moved Deke to climate action, and we're thankful for that. Tali Deaner is a college first-year student and climate activist. Tali is on the National Leadership Board of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement and a member of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement College Fellowship. Say that fast. Tali does have another appointment today and has to leave us a little early, so I'm thanking you in advance, Tali, for joining us today. And also join me in welcoming the third panelist, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. Reverend Moss does not need an introduction. He is internationally known and recognized as one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world. He's the senior pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, professor of homiletics at Mercer University's McAfee School of Theology, and also just a lifelong activist. Welcome to each of you. I am just so truly humbled to be with you today, but let's jump right in. Faith leaders are perfectly positioned to lead on climate for a number of reasons. They're trusted messengers, they have a platform, they believe in a higher purpose and calling, and they have a long tradition of doing justice. Tali, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about your story and how Judaism calls you to be involved in climate work.
Thanks so much, Carol. That's a great question. I think, Judaism originally, as growing up as a kid, I was taught really, really strongly to believe in justice. One of the central tenets of Judaism is tikkun olam, repairing the world. And so I was always kind of taught that we should be doing what we can to make the world a better place. And, as I was growing up, that's more like, helping a neighbor or something. But as I grew up, and started learning more about all of the big problems in our world that need fixing, I started to kind of make those connections a little bit more. I think the moment for me that really made me start thinking wow, I'm a teenager, but I really feel called to be participating in activism was, I think about 3 or 4 summers ago, I went to a summer camp with the ACLU, and, kids learning all about law and social justice. And there was someone there who actually was Jewish, but she was telling a story about how environmental racism had harmed her and her community. And it just made me think here's another 16-year-old sitting right next to me telling the story, and she's involved and she's changing the world. And so I can be doing that too. So as soon as I got home, I joined a group that I found online, and, I've kind of been doing it ever since. And now I'm a sleepaway camp counselor and educator, and I really try to get kids to make those connections between, these holy texts tell us that we need to do what's right, and what's right is, there's that quote that's marching is praying with your feet. And it's really true. Judaism says, in Deuteronomy, it says, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for all that you're doing to lead and to teach all that you come in contact with, including us older folks. Deke, as a climate scientist, you're always sounding an alarm for the coming impacts of climate change and call faith communities to action for the sake of future generations. Can you give us any hope?
Yeah, of course. There's always hope. One of the things that makes the climate change issue so frustrating is one of the things that adds hope. And it is both urgent and it is a very long-term issue. And faith communities, more so than maybe we appreciate, more so than I certainly appreciated myself, are so plugged in to generation to generation to generation to generation care, so connecting our ancestors with our old folks and our babies and our people that are yet to come is natural to what we do and how we think. And it's not so much characteristic of everyday America. And I think that's where faith communities really plug in. And, and I'll spare you the long story. I'm from Oklahoma. My grandmother was basically a victim of the Dust Bowl and kind of wandered around as a teenage girl and had a really rough go. And we'll spare the details. But, as a climate scientist, I go back and I look at the data and I see that the droughts of the 1950s were actually worse than those of the 1930s. So something happened from one generation to the next, and it was care. And she made it through with her children in a lot better shape than her experience in the 30s. And it was actually a harder punch from Mother Nature. But that generation did something. They cared. We learned a lot about science, soil management, water management, crop rotation. These are agricultural communities in the plains, but also home economics. The difference between the haves and have-nots in that part of the country was brought closer in the 50s. People made it through that climate episode one generation later better because it was a better time to live in that place. And I have reflect on that so much now as kind of an adult and a climate scientist looking back. I have opportunities today I would never have had except for the care that was invested in me 2 generations ago. I wake up every day thanking God for people I'll never meet that have been long since dead. And, climate change is an urgent issue, but the care that we provide and can provide, as we see, I think all throughout our practice, it flourishes and it amplifies and magnifies through generations. And I hope we can remember that because we are really equipped to think that way.
Wow. Thank you so much. Reverend Moss, you gave a great sermon at Princeton not too long ago called Stay Woke. And I recently had the privilege of attending a Buddy Guy concert and thought of that sermon, actually. And something I've been thinking on since your call in that sermon is that you called us to be more like jazz musicians. Can you share with us a little bit about how climate leaders and jazz musicians, might go together?
I certainly appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I'm just delighted to be a part of the conversation with the other phenomenal panelists and the work that they are doing. What is powerful about the jazz tradition and the blues tradition? I'll first begin with the blues tradition. The blues tradition is the existential examination of what is happening in our world. And people of African descent embrace the blues not to fall into despair, but to truly look at what is happening in the world, happening in their lives. And they connected it later on then with the gospel, because gospel and blues are the exact same chords. But it's the jazz tradition that's fascinating in terms of understanding how we are to function in democracy, to take instruments that are supposedly not supposed to play together, but yet they do. From the saxophone to the bass, to the piano, to the drum, and then the influences from people who are indigenous and people of African descent, French, German, Spanish. You can just go on and on and on. And I believe if we are to address the climate crisis, we have to have a jazz narrative. Well, what does that mean? A jazz narrative to address the climate crisis would mean that we have to put together the kind of band with the necessary specialists who are willing to play in the band, but not one particular instrument demanding supremacy. So, for example, the scientist, the researcher, you may play the bass to make sure that we are in that particular groove and we're hitting the correct rhythm. The community activists may be playing the drums so that we have a drum beat of justice in terms of our organizing within the community. The faith community can blow the trumpet to be able to sound the alarm and gather people together, as it is spoken about in Scripture. And then those who are writing policy can be the ones who are creating chords in terms of how we move in a particular direction. And then the art community, whether in poetry or visual art, you play that saxophone so that you are creating new sounds and rhythms. And each person in the band needs to solo. In other words, elevating their work within the civic arena so that people can understand what is happening, but we're all playing within the same band, moving in the same direction, because we have a deep love for creation and this planet. And I believe that the only way that we are going to be able to address the crisis is if we have a jazz narrative.
Oh, that was so beautiful. And I'm just envisioning, I love live jazz, but I'm just envisioning how each of us can back off a little bit to allow somebody else the spotlight, and that we can all not compete, but work together to make this beautiful music move forward. Oh my gosh, that is so amazing. And Tali, let's come back to you. Talking about working together, you're a younger person on this screen, and of those who are joining today, tell us a little bit about how we might better collaborate with people of your generation and younger folks.
Totally. Thanks so much, Carol. And thanks, everybody else. This has been so interesting. I think one thing that young people really bring to the table is new, fresh ideas, because as we've kind of seen, like in the news cycle, in our world today, everything is moving and changing so quickly, right? Like what we know, what's going on in terms of, the news and justice. I think about like 2 years ago, last April, was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And there were plans all across the country for people who were planning these huge Earth Day climate strikes. And here we are, now it's the 52nd Earth Day. But I think, I had all these plans that I had spent so long working on with people to have these in-person climate strikes. And obviously those are not going to happen. So we had to pivot, and we, it was an organization that was focused at young people, but as a high schooler, I was on the younger end, and we ended up, the high schoolers from this organization in Michigan ended up like coming up with our own training and leading this really big Zoom call, getting people to like write their own climate stories. And so we had to pivot. But I think as young people, we knew we were just so excited to be doing things that we had all these new, fresh ideas. So I think like, when we're working intergenerationally, really like listening to everything that everyone has to say, not just having them there. And I feel really lucky to be here today to have everyone listening to what I have to say. And yeah, I think young people have a lot of ideas and experience. And just because, we might not have a degree or a ton of experience in the field, I think there's a lot of valuable knowledge for me to gain working with people that are older than me, and for older people to learn from me.
Yes, I will say that in the chat, these last 3 days of this summit, the folks that people are most excited to hear from have been the younger folks. And I will also say on behalf of the older folks here, we have made a mess and we are willing to clean it up, but we do need to look to you all to help us have courage and to be willing to step out and to follow your lead. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And Deke, you have such a unique experience as a climate scientist. And I'm just wondering, because you do look back and up and forward into the future a lot as you're doing your work, how will the future people look back on this time?
That's a great question. First of all, this has been awesome. Thank you for the opportunity to hear these folks. It's great. So when we look back on this time, we won't be, this time when we are going to beat the challenge of climate change. It's not going to be a science story. It's not going to be an environmental story. It's not going to be a technological story or a historical story or a political story. It's an anthropological story. This ultimately, what we're going through is about who matters what matters, how we relate to each other, what we value. You know, that is the undercurrent in all of the challenges that we face with climate change. What do we use selfishly, and who does that affect? And no other community is as you know, and it's an epic problem. It's a big problem, and across our faiths, we live, tell, share, and celebrate stories that remind us how we stand against oppression, struggle, challenges, huge problems, how we think down generation to generation. We are so much more wired for this challenge. We should be in the front and helping folks organize their thoughts on big, complex, complicated challenge like this. And I know when we look back on this, that it will be communities like ours, not just us. I don't know what jazz instrument, you know, with the trumpet. You know, the trumpet will be seen as such a vital piece of this ensemble, but the action will be among the communities that can grasp how does oppression, how do our relationships with each other, how does our history, how we treat each other today and how we've treated each other in the past, how does that work its way into it? It's going to be such a part of the solution, and I think our faith communities are here to step up to that challenge.
Thank you. I agree. I think that faith communities are the ones who need to be leading this catastrophe that we're in, because as you have already said, and so have other speakers previously, this isn't a science problem. This is a spiritual problem. This is a moral problem. And the way out of it is by joining hands, by building relationships, by caring for the least of these among us, we say in the Christian tradition, the most vulnerable, the marginalized. And Reverend Moss, I'm a pastor, a preacher, you know, and I get a lot of inspiration from you. But I will say it's so easy when you're in the work of justice to become overwhelmed, to feel despair. But as a preacher, we are always called to bring the good news. And so I'm wondering if you can bring us some good news.
Well, thank you for that question. This is a moment of moral courage. It's a moment of civic responsibility. It's a moment of what in the African tradition we call a Sankofa moment, which means that you have to look back in order to move forward. And taking the wisdom, the knowledge, and the work of our ancestors and placing it on the altar of today so that we can fashion a world for tomorrow. As a preacher, we traffic in stories, and there is a story that I believe is apropos in terms of our calling. It is the minister, theologian, writer, and mystic by the name of Howard Thurman, who was a mentor intellectually of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He grew up in a segregated area of Florida, in Daytona, and he had the opportunity to develop under the tutelage of one of the greatest theologians he had ever met, his grandmother, who allowed him to witness the beauty of creation. And he would wander around the town and the rural areas. And one day he saw an elder, probably about 80, 87 or so, who was planting pecan or pecan trees, depending upon where you're from, whether it's pecan or pecan, and planting these trees. And young Howard Thurman, maybe about 10 years of age, saw this elder planting the trees and decided to walk up to him to raise a question. He said, "Sir, I see that you're planting these trees. And based upon where you are in life, you will never have the opportunity to taste the fruit from that which you planted." And the elder stopped, smiled at young Thurman, and simply said, "All my life, I've been eating from trees I did not plant. It's my responsibility to plant for another generation. And that is our responsibility. We don't have to cure it all, but we do have the responsibility while we have a brief time on this planet to plant something for someone we will never meet, we will never touch, we will never speak, but they will be blessed by the trees that we planted while we had our time on this earth.
That is just such a lovely image, and such a great call to action. If all of us reflect on what is something that I can do that I won't benefit from, but that others will. That's also such a call to who we are as people of faith. So I want to ask a question of the same question to all three of you now, but Tali, I'll start with you. And that is, if you were to call the folks who are joining us today to do one thing, what might it be? What one thing would you ask our audience today to do?
Wow. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Carol. That's a really good question. I think it's hard for me to say just one thing. But I think that, sorry, I live in a college dorm. It's a little loud. I think that what is really most important is that somebody does something and they do it often. Pirkei Avot, one of the famous Jewish texts, says, it is not, you are not free to desist from the work, nor are you, required to complete it. And so do something. I would say, the reason why we're in this position is not because because I used a single-use plastic today. It's because of corporations. So, our Jewish text calls work together. Get your school to take action. Get your institution to take action. Get your bank to take action. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. Deke, what about you?
I very much echo that. See our institutions as agents of change and good, which they are. And if that means the way you operate your physical plant, the way you weave messages into your educational programs, into your ministries, please, whether you're a lay person or a spiritual leader, please reappreciate yourself in this role as an agent that helps us face big, complicated problems that affect a lot of folks. Very, very, very much. Please help reflect that care in the way you run your programs, your physical plant, and most importantly, the future of your faith represented in those people and the work that they do.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Tali.
Thank you, Tali. I would say one of the things, well, it's certain steps to this one thing, but to cook a meal, set a table, and then bring someone to the table who is activist, policymaker, community leader, who is deeply passionate about dealing with the climate crisis, and allow their words and experience to be the roux for the meal that is being collectively eaten at that table. We need those spaces where people can truly be educated, not talked at, but talked with, so that we can begin to move to a greater type of action that can be transformative.
Yes, I think, first thing we started at 11 and Catherine Hayhoe was our first speaker, and kind of like what you are saying now, she was saying people don't have to do this for the same reason that you do, that I do, but by conversation, relationships, being open and listening, we can find a place where we can all have reasons that might be different to do this work to save humanity. We have a question from the audience that is a question about how do we speak to the older generations who feel that maybe they are too old or least equipped to contribute time and energy, etc. This person hears this a lot from the older folks in their congregation. And so you all have any perspectives about how to speak to older people about climate?
I would add that I would say the greenest people around are your seasoned saints. I learned what recycling was from my grandmother and other elders in the church, because what did they do? They made gumbo, which was taking bits and pieces of things that should have been thrown away and creating something new. They took pieces of cloth and created quilts. They went back into the garden and found something that they had grown that they could slap on your head, and all of a sudden you felt better when you got a cut. They already understood the interconnection between creation and one's body, and rebranding some of the things that they already know. Oh, there's a wealth of knowledge and power in our seasoned saints.
Oh, yes. I once had a church member early in my ministry who said, Carol, you're just really wanting us to do the things the way that we used to do them. And I said, oh, yeah. So I think that's true. If we can invite them to tell their stories of how did we used to do things when we didn't have single-use plastic? How did we used to eat when we didn't have drive-through restaurants? How did we, have them share their stories? Deke, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Not much. Yes. Just emphasize, I happen to come from a parish that was the first Catholic institution in North Carolina to go solar. And the team that made that happen, I was by far, and I'm no youngster, I was by far the youngest person and the least effective person, because the old folks, they know the score. They know how things get done. They just naturally, Reverend Moss, the connectedness, it just breathes through the older folks in the congregation. And, I think, in all of the themes that I've been talking about, the older folks represent that natural understanding of stewardship, of what we hand and how we hand it to coming generations, and also the wisdom of how to get stuff done. And I think if we can tap into that, the issue itself has a lot of big technical jargon and sciencey words, and there's a political undercurrent to a lot of it. But ultimately, it's about tapping into the wisdom to get stuff done and caring for the coming generations, not just within our institutions, but across the world.
Amazing. We just have 1 minute left, but I want to end on each of you, both of you, sharing a way that you care for your own spirit, your own health in this tough work. Deke, let's start with you.
Sure. I tap into gratitude a lot. We are all instruments of the care and the love that was afforded by our ancestors and to our ancestors. And those of us that have any capacity to do better have a responsibility to exercise that. So when I get frustrated, I have to turn to gratitude and to be truly thankful to be here at this time in this situation.
Oh, thank you. Reverend Moss?
I would say it's music, it's nature. Right now, it's the Final Four, some good food, and time to pray.
Yes, sir. Oh, thank you so much. This has just been amazing to be with you all. I can't tell you how humbled I am to have shared this virtual stage with you. And I just pray God's blessings on your work. I'm inspired and will be thinking about all that you all have said for some time. We're going to now move into our next session on the topic of climate justice. We'll be hearing from Reverend Lennox Yearwood, a minister and activist who is on the front line lines of climate advocacy and who's best known as founder and president of the Hip Hop Caucus. And Nellis Kennedy Howard, a Navajo woman, attorney, minister, and founder of ASDA Consulting. She has worked for Honor the Earth and Sierra Club and does so much great work. This session is going to be moderated by Rafi Gold, who was a co-founder and co-president of an environmental club at her high school. Rafi is an active member of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, is working for 1 year on 4 organic farms, learning farming, and will start at Princeton in the fall. Rafi, over to you.